Hello and welcome to my talk on behalf of Camp YA, an online and streaming bookish adventure. My name is Anna Mainwaring and I'm going to be talking to you today about this idea of retelling, of taking an existing story and putting a new twist on it and creating a new work of fiction that offers something new and fresh. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, what I've written, and what I've learned in the process of my writing and my studies. So in a little bit more detail, here are two of the books that I have written and had published, Rebel with a Cupcake and Tulip Taylor. And here is my obligatory flattering author photo. Obviously, I'm not really sitting in a messy study with a rather recalcitrant hamster. If you hear gnawing at the bars in a minute, that's her, Marcy, making a bid for freedom. And I may or may not be still sitting in my pyjamas, but for the sake of the PowerPoint, you have my rather nice photo. So let me talk to you a little bit about my books, and then I'll make a connection between what I've written and the topic of my talk today. So my first book, Rebel with a Cupcake, is about a larger teen who starts off having a lot of confidence, body confidence, social confidence, and then because of an online interaction she loses that confidence and then goes on a journey to discover that again. And then my second book, Tulip Taylor, both of these are published by Firefly, is about a makeup blogger who is often underestimated because she has this passion for makeup. People look at her and they see a conventionally pretty girl who seems very interested in what she looks like, and they often underestimate her and think that she's vain or stupid. For a variety of reasons, she finds herself going on a teen version of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. And she finds out that she's been set up to fail by the TV company. So the novel is about, can she prove everybody, including herself to some extent, to prove that they're wrong about her and she's more than just a pretty face. So both my books, I'd like to think, are funny, they are positive, and they take on big themes such as body image and social media, because those are two of the themes that I find myself returning to. And you might be sitting there thinking, oh, they sound quite interesting, hopefully. But how is that connected to retellings? Well, let me explain. So, you are now looking at a copy of my front cover, Tulip Taylor, alongside a penguin cover of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. One of the quotations, one of the reviews that came in for Tulip Taylor is, it's a Pride and Prejudice for our times, which is incredibly flattering. And obviously I'm not aspiring to the literary heights of Jane Austen, but I did take some elements of Pride and Prejudice and incorporated them into Tulip Taylor. So why? I created the situation and I created the characters, but I was worried a little bit about the character dynamic, and I was also worried about the plot, I think, in the second half. And I was doing a lot of reading about other novels or other films that followed a similar kind of dynamic. And obviously one of the tropes I was using was enemies to lovers, which is a very powerful and popular trope. At the same time, I was also teaching Pride and Prejudice because I am an author. Sorry, I am a teacher as well as an author. And I was teaching Pride and Prejudice as a GCSE option, which isn't one of the more common options because it's quite long and it's seen as a challenging text. And I've taught Pride and Prejudice for many years, and the dynamic for students is often quite similar, that they kind of start off not necessarily wanting to read it, being put off because it's long, being put off because of the language in which it's written, It was published in the early 19th century, so the sentence length is different and the syntax can be different, and they often start off a little bit reluctantly. But then they're engaged by the story and the characters, and by the end, the vast majority of them are rooting for the characters. They find it funny, they find it interesting, they are kind of caught up with the ways in which Elizabeth is trying to abide by the society in which she lives in, but also challenge them as well. As I was teaching Pride and Prejudice and thinking about my novel and thinking that there were some overlaps, I did kind of think, well, why not just take the elements that Austen obviously totally nailed, the dynamics of being someone overlooking you and then you learning to realise that you actually quite like them. So yeah, I wanted to go from this dynamic of being misjudged and also misjudging others to understanding yourself and others, which for me is at the heart of Pride and Prejudice. Because Elizabeth's dynamic isn't just about her love for Darcy, it's that she learns who she is, she learns who her strengths and weaknesses are through her feelings for him, and that they both have to overcome a number of hurdles before they can achieve happiness in their relationship. And that's what I wanted to write about in Tulip Taylor. So whilst the novel isn't my novel, Tulip Taylor is not a straightforward retelling of Pride and Prejudice. It does take elements of it. It does take some of the character dynamics and reuses them. And so for me, that was a really powerful way to make my novel stronger than it was in its existing way. And I think that's one of the reasons why Tulip Taylor does resonate powerfully with those who read it. So I am a huge fan of looking at works that are important to you and seeing if you can retell them in a new, interesting and relevant way. So retellings are incredibly popular. They are a cornerstone of part of the market in YA and for adult readers as well. I'm not going to touch on retellings in picture books or middle grade, but again, they're very common there. So I've got a selection of retellings here. Obviously I could have chosen many more, but these are some of the ones that have been very popular recently. So the queen of retellings is probably Madeline Miller. And if you haven't read her work, then you really should, because she's an extraordinary writer. So some years ago, she wrote The Song of Achilles, which takes on these characters from the Trojan myths. Achilles is the most well-known character out of those, and as well known as a hero and a fighter. And I'm not sure about my pronunciation here, but Patroclus is his lover, and often in modern discussion of that, he's been kind of reduced to a friend or a cousin or a relative, but Madeline Miller absolutely wanted to embrace this as a love story between two men and writes from Patroclus's point of view. And I think, I mean, the reason why she's so popular is that her just writing style is stunning. So yes, her writing is incredibly successful because she does do retellings, but also because her writing is just so beautiful. She's also done Circe, I think is the pronunciation, which is a more obviously feminist retelling of a character in Greek myth who has often been described as a witch and someone who damaged the hero Theseus, and Miller retells that story, giving her a stronger point of view. So many other writers have now chosen to retell Greek myths. She's kind of spawned a whole kind of retelling industry. I'm told that agents and publishers are coming to the end of their interest in that this particular retelling of Greek myths might have come to its end, but who knows whether that's correct or not. if you have a passion to rewrite a Greek myth and you think you've got a new way of doing it, then absolutely that's something you should consider. And then also here we've got two very successful American retellings, Cinder and A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which is a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast myth. Then we've got two UK writers, maybe not quite so well known as the American ones, but absolutely fabulous works. Melinda Salisbury's Her Dark Wings, which is a retelling of the Persephone myth. And that's such a resonant myth, isn't it, really? Girl, young woman, taken from her mother, taken to the underworld. Does she, or is she there of her own free will? Is she trapped in this relationship with Hades, Lord of the Underworld? And then the choice she has, or that her mother has, that she can live for 3 months in the upper world, which is spring and summer. Sorry, 6 months, and then 6 months back in the underworld, which is winter and autumn. So again, that's a myth that resonates in so many different ways. You can see why people are drawn to that. And then The Deathless Girls by Kieran Millward Hargreaves is slightly different because it isn't based on a myth or a fairy tale like everything else on this screen, but is actually a retelling of part of Dracula, so the novel by Bram Stoker, Gothic Victorian novel, which popularised the Dracula myth. So the Dracula myths, I suppose so, Dracula is a retelling of its own, really. It takes these myths of Eastern Europe and forms them into a cohesive narrative about this count. Hargreaves takes the brides of Dracula, who are mentioned in the early part of the original novel, and she makes those her narrators and focuses her novel on their experiences. So that's slightly different because that's taking an existing piece of literature and then adding to that, and I'll expand on that in a moment. So yeah, just to clarify that, what constitutes a retelling? Well, obviously the name gives it away a little bit. It's about a story that exists already in some form, and then a writer finds a new way of telling that story and twists it in some kind of way. So the most common ones come from fairy tales, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and then obviously the myths, and the Greek myths are the ones which are most well known, but Celtic mythology obviously influences an awful lot of fantasy. So many fantasy novels draw on Celtic mythology, Celtic names, the tropes of that mythology, and brings that to life. So many retellings would be based on some kind of fairy tale, something out of oral literacy, or some kind of myth. Then there is the possibility of building on a literature which has already been written. So I developed the plot of Pride and Prejudice and the characters of Pride and Prejudice and Tulip Taylor, and others have taken a work of literature and either focused on a character who isn't central, who is apparently more tangential, who isn't maybe the protagonist, and created a work out of that. Now, I'm based in the UK, and the UK copyright laws are, as I understand, that a work is in copyright until 100 years after the author's death. So until, if you're thinking of writing a retelling of an existing work of literature, then that would only be possible 100 years after the author's death. The only exception to that I know of is the work of J.M. Barrie and Peter Pan, and that has a different copyright. I'm struggling for the word there, but the copyright is different for that. because it's linked to Great Ormond Street Hospital. So yeah, Peter Pan is therefore off limits. But you may need to check, if you're not based in the UK, you might need to check the copyright laws of where you live. So, for example, in the UK, and I think in the US, the writings of Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes are just starting to come out of copyright, which is why you're starting to see more TV shows based on Sherlock Holmes, because Conan Doyle died more than 100 years ago. But obviously the works of Shakespeare, Georgian novelists, Victorian novelists, the copyright on those texts has generally expired. So if you are drawn to any of those and feel that you want to tell them in a new way, then that should be okay. But obviously you would need to do your own research on them. So yes, you can do a retelling, but why? And I was thinking about that, and I think the most powerful reason for doing a retelling is that it does kind of get round this conundrum, if you like, of what agents and publishers are looking for. So they often say they want something new but the same, and that's kind of quite a difficult thing to achieve. But I think through retellings you can do that. People will be familiar with some aspects of the original, but you're offering them something new. So it's kind of also a good way to sell a new novel, a new story. You know, it is X versus another text. If you're telling someone it's a retelling of the Persephone story, then that might gain it an audience. So it can get round this idea of finding a new way into something old, breathing life, new life into older ideas. And as I found with Tulip Taylor and Pride and Prejudice, it can help you with character and plot. By retelling, you do want to recraft it and recreate it into something new, but it can help you with giving you some idea of what the character might be like. Can you shift and change it and make it some new, but at least you've got some starting material. And whilst you don't want to slavishly follow the plot of what the originals might be, it gives you some idea of direction. And even if you change the ending or twist the ending of what people might expect, then you do have something to work with. And that can be something you can play with as a writer. People want stories that follow a realistic path, but they also want something new. So if they're expecting the plot to go in one direction because they know the original story, and you play with that and play with their expectations and offer them something new, then that can be another way of making your work stand out. So there are lots of reasons why a retelling can work and be a very powerful thing. But of course, then you are thinking about what story should you retell? There are so many out there. And I would say with all writing, you need to follow your passions and your interests. So, of any myths or fairy tales that you've read or experienced, any classic literature which is out of copyright, what haunted you? What thrilled you? What enchanted you? What characters do you return to and feel that you have a connection with? Writing a novel takes a long time and a lot of effort, so you need to have that connection with your source material. And I'll talk in a minute about sort of the various literatures that have called to me and why. So there's that connection, that emotional connection between you and the story, but you're also looking for the new publishing agents are looking for something new. Is there an element in that story which has not been heard before? You don't generally want to take the main protagonist. You would want to maybe take someone who's less well known, someone in the background, and maybe twist it to their point of view. You do want to update the story. You don't just want to slavishly rewrite it. Most of these myths, most of these retellings existed in a patriarchal world. Do you want to retell it in a way where a female character maybe has more agency, more choice than she does in the original? Do you want to challenge the patriarchal version? Do you want to change the ending so your character is making a more positive, different choice? So it's being drawn to the familiar, being drawn to some kind of passion, but also finding a way to relate it to the modern world. You also need to think about the connection between you and the story, and a really important thing to think before embarking on a project: is it your story to tell? If it's part of your culture, if there's a strong connection between you and the culture of that particular myth, then, you know, and it's a myth that maybe hasn't been well written about before. As I say, if that's you and your culture, then that would be an amazing thing to write about, and I think publishers will be very keen to read something like that. But you do need to avoid that you're just cherry picking and choosing a story because it's new and not thinking about whether there is that connection between you and the story. So that is just one note of caution to think about. So these are various myths or pieces of literature which I felt a very strong connection to. I read Jane Eyre when I was about 13 or 14, and like many people, I felt a very strong link between myself and the protagonist. We were both from Yorkshire from a start. We both liked to or went for walks on the moors, so perhaps I was more interested in it than Jane herself was. Jane knows that she's not considered conventionally attractive, and she often felt hemmed in by the world that she lived in and wanted something more. And wanted to live beyond the parameters of the gardens that she found herself in, or the valleys that she was living in. And I certainly felt that growing up in Leeds, that there was that sense of there was a world out there that I wanted to live in and embrace. And so Jane for me was a voice for those feelings in a way that I'd not read before. And many people are drawn to rewriting Jane Eyre, and I was looking at this a couple of years ago and came across steampunk versions of Jane Eyre, futuristic Jane Eyre, science fiction's Jane Eyre. So clearly I am far from being alone in feeling that connection. And the work of Charlotte Bronte has been updated and retold in lots of powerful and different ways. So if you are thinking about doing a retelling of a particular story, do check out what has been done already and making sure you are doing something new. I loved the work of Mary Stewart and the Crystal Cave when I was a similar sort of age, and this was a retelling of the Arthurian myths. I mean, there are books to be written and have been written on the various permutations of the Arthurian myth, but this was a version where Merlin was the central protagonist, which I think is an excellent choice because in many ways Arthur himself is the least interesting character, and I was always enjoyed the women, and I felt and still feel that the women in the Tales of Arthur are so fascinating because they can be presented as powerless. Guinevere doesn't produce an heir, which is her main function, and that seems to reduce her in some kinds of way. And then you've got these women with magical powers, Morgan Le Fay, Morgause, and so some women kind of overcompensate by that power, for that lack of power, through magical power, which is a theme that's always drawn me. And then finally, another myth that I've always been drawn to, and the one that I'm sort of focusing on in my writing at the moment, is the figure of Medusa. She's a figure of horror, she's a figure of pity, she's a powerful killer, and yet her ability to kill others is punishment for her own assault. Medusa, I think, until relatively recently was seen as a kind of monster, but I think because of a desire to look at myth in a more nuanced way, she's now become this sort of powerful figure of female rage, and also someone who transcends the horror of the things that have been done to her. And I think this idea of taking an old myth and finding something new to say about her is something that people are definitely doing about Medusa. And, you know, I'm writing about Medusa now. I don't want to go into precise details, but these are two books that have been written about Medusa and come out in the last year or so, which are phenomenal, very, very different. They take the same tale, but they tell you something very different about her. So Natalie Hines is written for adults. It isn't particularly focused on Medusa herself, but more on Perseus and the gods who are controlling and manipulating him. Perseus is not a hero. He is stupid. He is vain. He only achieves anything because Athena helps him. And again, she is not she's a powerful goddess, but she's also cruel and self-obsessed and egotistical. And Medusa is just a pawn in their system. It is very funny, it is very bleak, it is harrowing, but I absolutely loved it. Jessie Burton's Medusa is very different. It is a much more traditional retelling of Medusa. It's quite small in geographical scope. Medusa lives in a cave on an island. She rarely goes out. The change in this version of Medusa is that she can only kill men with her gaze, so her sisters and those around her on the island are not vulnerable. But then Perseus arrives. We know Perseus is a threat to Medusa. She does not, and finds him incredibly appealing and beguiling. Again, it's beautifully, beautifully written. And there is a really strong connection to the modern world on the last page, even though for the most part it's set in a more traditional Medusa setting. So if you do have a theme or that you're drawn to, or a tale that you're drawn to, and there are other existing texts about it, if you've got a new way of talking about it, writing about it, and you can do so with passion and skill, there still can be a role for your retelling alongside others. So again, just two more to touch on, because these are ones that I've read recently and sort of do wonderful things with Greek myth. I'm just going to touch briefly on Joseph Coelho, and again, apologies if I've not pronounced that correctly. In Boy in the Maze, he writes about Theo in modern day London, who is researching Theseus in the Greek myths. And a third voice is also the voice of the Minotaur. So in this retelling, he balances those different voices: modern day Theo, Greek classic time of Theseus, and also the Minotaur, who acts as a kind of mirror image to Theseus. And it's a really inventive, really interestingly way of structuring those different tales. And whilst Theo isn't necessarily lost in a maze, he is in a maze of trying to find his identity, trying to find his father, trying to find out who he is. And then in The Girl Who Became a Tree, the story is inspired by the myth of Daphne, who escapes from the Greek god and is transformed into a tree. But in this version, the tree, the forest that Daphne is lost in, is a library, with obviously the idea of books coming from trees, and it's about grief. So the idea of losing yourself in the forest becomes a way of dealing with grief, which again is very, very interesting, very, very imaginative, very powerful. And so if you are thinking about retellings and you kind of want to push the boundaries of how to do it, then those two texts certainly might be worth looking at. So as I come to the end of what I wanted to talk about, these are just quick reminders of various things I've mentioned before, but before you kind of commit yourself to something, have you considered these points? Have you got a new way in? Does it relate to the modern world? I personally think there's little point slavishly writing something that's authentic but might not resonate with modern day authors. Again, is it your story to tell? Are you writing about something that's within your own culture or outside it? And with many of these stories, there can be quite dark elements in them. Have you addressed those? Have you thought about them? You don't necessarily need to include them, but you do need to consider them. So Greek myths, fairy tales often have dark and difficult content, and you do need to think these through before you maybe commit to the project in full. So on the more positive side, what are you looking for? You want to find that voice, that new voice. So yes, you might be taking a character who's already been created, but you're trying to give them a new voice, because that is the number one thing that agents and publishers are looking for, that new, strong, vibrant voice that just stands out and grabs the audience straight away. Hopefully that voice will come from you finding something you're passionate to write about, a theme or a motif of situation that you find enthralling, and you can pass that passion on to your reader. And again, it's about finding the writing style, voice, passion, style. Those are all the things that are sometimes hard to teach, but you see it through reading the best that there is on offer, and trying to learn how to find your own style that makes your work stand out. You want your work to be distinctive, and that's what you can do in this kind of writing. So to finish off, retellings offer familiarity whilst exploring something new, and as we've mentioned before, that's such a powerful concept. Many of us who are writers were passionate readers as young people. Many of you may be young people, but find out where your passion lies and embrace that, because that's part of finding your voice. On a practical level, it gives your work structure, which can make life so much easier as a writer. And you can draw on such powerful motifs and images. PowerPoint software decided to give me someone walking into a maze, but the idea of a maze is such a powerful image. It doesn't have to be literal, it can be metaphorical. Thinking about fairy tales, I'm kind of haunted by Hansel and Gretel lost in the forest, being abandoned by their parents, following glittering stones in the moonlight. That's something that kind of I'm really drawn to. Similarly, Rapunzel, she's locked in this tower. She's both trapped and freed by her own beauty. Again, to me, that's such a resonant image. So I think the note I want to finish on is this idea that motifs, images, symbols, all these things can be so resonant for writing, and can help you pull all of that power into your work so that you can create something new and extraordinary. So thank you for listening for that. If you have any questions, my Twitter and Instagram details were at the beginning. I'm Anna_Mainwaring, pronounced Mainwaring on Twitter, and Anna Mainwaring Clark, Mainwaring Clark on Instagram. So if you have any questions or you want to discuss that at any greater length, then do get in touch, and I hope you enjoy all your other workshops and book events with Camp YA. Thank you very much.